Father, this is a precious and beautiful word that you bring through your prophet Isaiah, and I ask that it would speak to our own hearts this morning. Lord, this is the kind of word that meets us in places of pain and does healing work, and I pray that it would do that work in each of us this morning. We all have places of pain in our hearts. Please come, Holy Spirit. Despite my own inadequacy as a speaker, despite our own inability to meet together right now as a community, would you just overcome all of the obstacles? Despite my bad internet, would you just overcome the obstacles and do your work, because we cry out to you for health and healing in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'm going to show you another picture here. I'm sure you recognize this. So in the last week of Jesus's life, he spent a lot of time here in the temple in Jerusalem. And this is a reconstruction, but it's based on a lot of archaeology. The temple probably looked a good deal like this. And, you know, it was a vitally important place for the Jewish people. It was right at the center of their national identity. This was kind of their national monument. And it was also, of course, at the center of their religious identity. And so the people of Israel would come from all over the country to the temple 3 times a year for the great feasts. But we remember that very few people actually got to go inside. So, you know, in normal times, you can still go inside the Washington Monument and climb to the top. I don't know if you still can after 9/11, but in normal times you could have. But if you think about this center of worship, if you look at these high walls and kind of battlements all around it, in a sense, these walls were to distinguish between who could go in. So I think I've shown this before, but this is a plan of the temple. And if you were a Gentile, no matter how God-fearing you were, you could only enter the temple as far as the orange section, the court of Gentiles outside. And actually, if you were diseased or if you had a disability, you couldn't even come in that close. Then if you were a Jewish woman, you could go a little bit further. You could enter the pink court right there, the court of women, which got you a bit closer to the temple. But only Jewish men could go in through the Nicanor gate and get into the actual courtyard where the temple stood. So ordinary Jewish men could stand in the court of Israelites in that sort of light blue section. Then priests could get up closer. They could get around the temple itself in the court of priests, that sky blue section. So only the priests, you had to be a priest to actually even touch the outside of the temple walls. And then you had to be assigned duties in the temple as a priest to even go inside, which is that indigo section. And then you remember that deep in the middle, that purple section with an M on the plan, that's the Holy of Holies. And you remember that only one man, the high priest, could ever go inside there, only once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. All right, so this is like, it's very hierarchical structure. You could even say exclusive structure of the temple. And we remember that this wasn't Maki. It was actually designed by God way back in Exodus in the tabernacle for the sake of holiness, this rings within rings, courts within courts. But we also remember that this whole structure was also destroyed by God. It was destroyed at the instant that Jesus died, when God ripped the curtain of the temple in two from top to bottom. He opened up the Holy of Holies, in fact, to everybody. So now this temple plan that we see here, it doesn't stand anymore. It no longer stands physically in Jerusalem, and the system of it no longer stands theologically either. But here's what I wonder. I wonder to what extent things feel a bit like this sometimes within the church today. So here's what I want to ask you guys. Do you ever feel personally like you're only allowed into God's house and into God's presence some of the way? You're like, thus far and no further. Like either God or his people are sort of holding you at arm's length. And maybe that's because you feel like there's something wrong with you, something wrong inside you, either some ill health or some disability in your body or mind that disqualifies you. And there's a wall that says you can't come in any further than this. Or perhaps it's because you feel like a foreigner with some kind of cultural distance between you and your worshiping community, or some kind of language gap. Or perhaps it's because you're a woman and you can only come in as far as the court of women. Or maybe because you have same-sex attraction and that makes you feel different and like you don't belong in the center of things. You don't belong right near to God and his throne. Or maybe just it's singleness in a community culture that prefers and promotes marriage. Or maybe do you feel stuck on the periphery because you're not ordained, as if it's still the case that the real center of the action is for the priests. Only the priest can go into the Holy of Holies and come to the throne of God. Now, it's understandable if you feel that way, but that's like precisely the idea that I want to challenge this morning, because the word of God in Isaiah 56 tells such a different story. So we'll get done with these slides here. All right. So if you can read your Bible, find Isaiah chapter 56 now, the part that Stephanie read for us, Isaiah 56. And this is God's word to eunuchs. We're going to focus on the eunuchs particularly, because the word to eunuchs turns out to be a word of God to everyone who feels stuck on the outside. You know, it's like one of these places where if God can elevate the most excluded person, he can in the same breath elevate everybody together. Now we remember that in the New Testament, we meet one eunuch. We meet the Ethiopian eunuch, right, who Philip shares the gospel with as he's returning home to Ethiopia after one of the great feasts. So he'd just come to the temple and he was heading home. And Philip meets him as he's reading from the scroll of Isaiah, right? And he's reading chapter 53 at the time. And Philip shares the gospel of Jesus with him, baptizes him. And I love to imagine that Ethiopian eunuch climbed back aboard his chariot and carried on his journey and opened up Isaiah again at the same place and kept on reading, because if he'd kept on reading, he would have arrived almost immediately at Isaiah chapter 56 and come to the only place in the whole Old Testament that addresses eunuchs directly, that gives them a prophecy of hope for eunuchs. And he would have begun his Christian life with these words: "For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which shall not be cut off." And if that was true, if he did keep reading and read those words, we can only imagine how like personally met he would have felt by the Lord and how much those words would have ministered to his pain. Because these verses are kind of like a love letter from God to eunuchs and by extension to everyone who is the most downtrodden and ruined and excluded people in the world. And we recognize that if God can speak this way to eunuchs in the 6th century BC, he will also speak this way to every marginalized person. Because think what it must have been like to be a eunuch in the ancient world. I've never heard of there being eunuchs in the modern world, but the ancient world was actually full of them. Pretty much every king's court in the ancient Near East, apart from Israel, was staffed by eunuchs. They were the servants, and they were the attendants and the officials of the king's court. And they were made eunuchs for the sake of complete loyalty and obedience to the king, right? So eunuchs were men who had been forced into a lifelong slavery to a master who had physically mutilated them. And that mutilation was an indelible mark of possession. It said, "You will never be your own man again. You will always belong to me. The normal, respectable life of a husband and father is forever taken from you. You are a shameful creature now. Your name is cut off, and from now on, you're going to serve my name only." That was their status in society. And we can well imagine that a eunuch would come to the point of saying the words of verse 3, "Behold, I am a dry tree." Can you imagine how helpless and hopeless you would feel in their position? They would say, in other words, like, what good can I do now? What good can I be in the world now? Because a tree is supposed to bear fruit. That's its purpose. And a dry tree is just dead and fruitless and worthless. So I wonder if there are any reasons that we ourselves have had cause to be tempted to say in our own words, "Behold, I'm a dry tree." Maybe we say it because we can't have children, or we couldn't get married for whatever reason, or we were so weighed down by bodily weakness or tiredness that we didn't feel that we could be any much use in the world, or all our plans came to nothing, or all the fruit of them was stolen. We just might have a lot of reasons for saying, behold, I'm a dry tree. But God tells the eunuch he mustn't say that. Even though in his case, it was because he just didn't have a life of his own. He had no wife, no children, no name, or any hope of getting one. How precious is God's promise to him when God says, I will give you a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. So what this is it's a promise to give eunuchs back the sense of identity that was taken away from them, and to give them a better legacy than children would ever give. Because God says it's going to be a name that's within his own house and within his own walls. Right, so think about that temple exclusive system. Who could even get within God's house and his own walls? But these eunuchs are going to be honored right there in the heart of things, not in the outskirts, not outside the periphery, but right in the heart of God's own house, a reputation among the great. God also says it's going to be an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So to those who physically had their chance of a name cut off, God promises that's never going to happen with him. And these promises go straight to the heart of a eunuch's pain. And the language in verse 5 even suggests that there's more to come, because the phrase that we find in there, a monument and a name, is a very rich phrase. So in Hebrew, you might know this. The phrase a monument and a name is Yad Vashem. I will give you a monument and a name. And you might know that Yad Vashem is the name of the Israeli Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. It's the World Holocaust Remembrance Center. It's called Yad Vashem. And the museum is named after this verse in Isaiah 56. I will give you a monument and a name. Of course, they were thinking of all of the 6 million dead Jewish people in the Holocaust, and them receiving a monument and a name. And it's fascinating that the Jewish people in Israel took this verse, which applies to eunuchs in Isaiah 56, to foreigners, to strangers, and it applies it to the children of Israel, the persecuted children of Israel. So we went to this museum when I visited Israel, and my Israeli tour guide, who's a native Hebrew speaker, explained kind of the sense, the meaning behind the name. She explained that yad in Hebrew can mean monument, but most of the time it means hand. It's the Hebrew word for hand. So the promise in Isaiah 56 could be translated, I will give you a hand and a name. And then she stood there in the front of the bus and asked us, who is it in society who gives somebody else a hand and a name? And we thought about it for a while, and then we answered, a bridegroom, right? So he gives his beloved his hand in marriage, and then in the marriage ceremony, he gives her his name as well. And my tour guide nodded, and that was kind of exactly what she was going for. And if she was right to read the text this way, then perhaps within this promise to eunuchs who would obviously never marry is actually the hint of a proposal of marriage from God himself, saying, I will give you a hand and a name. It's very beautiful. God says that he's going to honor the people who honor him. So that's the first thing I want to notice in Isaiah 56, is that the outsiders, the eunuchs, and then also by extension, the foreigners, are remembered by God. They're honored by him. They don't ever have to fear being separated off from his people, God says. But there's a second part of this. There's a very important corollary. And that's that these same foreigners and eunuchs are also people who honor God, right? And that's also very clear in the passage. They're people who seek the glory of his name. So God speaks to three groups of people in this passage in Isaiah 56. First of all, he speaks to Israel. Then he speaks to the eunuchs, and then he speaks to the foreigners. And we hear God saying essentially the same thing to each of those three groups. So first in verse 1, God tells Israel, keep justice and do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come, and my righteousness be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. All right, so God's calling his people. He's really calling them to holiness, right? He's saying, my salvation's coming. And so the priority of holiness is more important than ever. Get ready, get your hearts ready for the coming of the Lord. And he specifically mentions keep the Sabbath. And I think Sabbath keeping was just a key mark of Old Testament holiness to the Lord, because nobody in the other nations kept the Sabbath. Nobody would think to do such a costly thing as keep the Sabbath unless they were setting themselves apart for the Lord in obedience to his word. All right. So then second, in verse 4, God addresses the eunuchs, and he uses very, very similar words to them too. He says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant. There's a lot of language overlap in what God says. So God says that eunuchs are going to be welcome too, but not just by virtue of being eunuchs, right? They're not welcome just because they're excluded. They're welcome by virtue of having a heart that wants to please God and a will to hold fast to his covenant. So there's a choice that the eunuchs have made first, and God is honoring them for honoring him. And then in verse 6, exactly the same language is applied a third time, and this time it's to the foreigners. And God says, and the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and hold fast to my covenant. You see that same language coming up again when we talk about the foreigners. So the promise to all three groups is there at the end. These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Okay, so what I understand this to mean is, as Jesus said, the Father is seeking worshipers who will worship him in spirit and truth. And if we will do that, if anyone will do that, if we will come and approach him in the way that he has shown us, then no one is going to be turned away. And it doesn't matter what we've done in the past or where we come from. It doesn't matter what kind of shame we carry. If we will give ourselves to God, if we will devote our lives to his honor and his name, then he will remember us and honor us in return and give to each of us an everlasting name. Now, some of what makes us feel ashamed is real, is really shameful. And those things God will heal. And some of what makes us ashamed is not actually shameful. We've just been made to feel ashamed by a fallen world. And those things God will comfort. But nothing that makes us feel ashamed is disqualifying. None of it means that God will reject us if we come to him. That's the promise of Isaiah 56, which of course is filled out in much more glorious detail in the New Testament. Isaiah was looking ahead to the future when he wrote these words, 600 years before Jesus came, and Jesus brought those words to pass. At the moment he died on the cross and the Father tore the curtain in the temple in two from top to bottom, that was the moment that God's house truly became a house of prayer for all nations. And since Jesus's blood pays for all of us, now anyone in the world can be holy. Anyone can be a saint. And indeed, anyone can be a great saint. Because it doesn't depend on who we are or where we came from. It depends on Jesus and his work in us. And it depends on how much we love and accept and embrace and want that work in us. All right, so I have three brief applications that I want to draw out of this. The first is to anyone who feels like an outsider. The second to anyone who feels like an insider. And then there's the third for all of us as we take on the role of evangelists. So first for the outsiders. For anyone who feels in some way stuck outside the temple walls, you might be quite near to the action, but not very near. And I don't know what it is that keeps you out there. Maybe it's your own choice. Maybe you just don't want to come any closer, close enough, but not too close. Or maybe it's not your choice. Maybe you feel like you're held outside at a distance by others for any of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Your past or your pedigree or ethnicity or gender or sexuality, or for evil that you've done or for evil that's been done to you, or for whatever fact about yourself that you feel is in some way disqualifying. I want to tell you on the authority of God's word that it is not disqualifying. And God's heart is to gather you in, just as he gathered the lost sheep of Israel. You too are invited further up and further in. You're invited by God to the greatest life imaginable, to be a saint, and even a great saint. And God himself has removed every barrier that might prevent you from coming and nailed those to the cross of Jesus. So all that remains is the question of, will you come? Do you want this new life in God? Because if you do, then nothing's going to prevent you from having it. The second word is to the insiders and to those who feel confident in our status as sons and daughters of God. And scripture says we should feel a sense of confidence if we believe in the name of Jesus and put our trust. But it also says, take care and let he who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Because if our confidence is in anything other than in the sheer mercy of God to us, then it is a false confidence. And Jesus warns in his word that plenty of people who are full of false confidence will come to him on the last day and hear the dreadful words, I never knew you. And they will say, I prophesied in your name, and I worked miracles in your name, and I preached in your name, and I wrote books in your name, and I wore all the right slogans, and I held all the right opinions. And Jesus will say, I never knew you. Because we have placed our confidence in our own status as insiders, which is just what the Pharisees did, and not in the mercy of God. And we forgot to hold fast to his covenant and chase after holiness. So the word to outsiders is take heart, and the word to insiders is take care. And now for all of us, as we take on the work of evangelists and bring the gospel of Jesus to people who haven't understood it, will we remember that as we meet people, we're always talking to potential saints? Maybe that sounds obvious, but maybe it's easy to forget that this person in front of me who's in prison, or who bears terrible scars of suffering, or who doesn't speak English very well, or who's stuck in addiction, or wherever it is we find them, this person, they still have all the necessary raw material to become a very great saint, maybe to far eclipse our own love for Jesus and zeal for his name, and to become the kind of hero that books are written about. All they need is Jesus and a heart set on fire for him, and endless transformation is possible. So will we speak to them not only to challenge them to repent, but also to invite them to a life of glory? Will we make that part of our message and speak it with honesty and hopefulness? All right, so those are my 3 applications. And as we go into our breakout groups now, I just want to ask simply, what struck you this morning about Isaiah 56, the passage that Sarah talked about and I talked about? And it's fine if you want to talk a lot more about what Sarah said. So what struck you from Isaiah 56? And then secondly, if you've got a comfortable group and you feel safe, how do these verses speak to your own heart?